Chapter 1. Irene hadn't planned on ending up in a Las Vegas club, much less with a stranger whose presence made the air between them crackle with tension. She had come to the city for a weekend getaway, one last breath of freedom before her interview at Harrington Enterprises, a company she had spent months preparing to impress. Her best friend Maya had convinced her that one night of fun wouldn't hurt. "Just one drink, Irene." "One. You deserve it," Maya had said, dragging her to an upscale club where the music pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. She should have stopped at one drink. But then, he happened. Daniel. She didn't know his last name, only that he had an arrogant smirk and eyes that seemed to see straight through her. He had approached her at the bar, offering her a drink with a casual confidence that made it clear he wasn't used to hearing no. But Irene wasn't one to fall easily. "I don't take drinks from strangers," she had said, raising an eyebrow at him. "Then it's a good thing I don't plan to be a stranger for long." Something about him, his deep, velvety voice, the way he held himself like he owned the room, made her intrigued. She had planned to leave, but instead she stayed. One drink turned into two. Two turned into laughter, teasing, and stolen touches. And then, a whirlwind of blurred memories. Champagne. A limo ride. His lips brushing against her skin as they stumbled into a penthouse suite, his hands gripping her waist, pulling her closer, a rush of heat, a tangle of sheets, whispers in the dark, and finally, flashes of them standing in front of a Vegas wedding officiant, her laughing breathlessly as Daniel smirked down at her. Married. They got married. The next morning, Irene woke up with a splitting headache and a sinking feeling in her stomach. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the ridiculously expensive suite she had no recollection of entering. A soft groan escaped her lips as she turned, only to freeze. Daniel was lying next to her, shirtless, the sheets tangled around his waist. Her heart nearly leaped out of her chest. "Oh my God." Daniel stirred at the sound of her voice, his lashes fluttering open. When his gaze landed on her, a lazy smirk curved on his lips. "Morning, wife." Wife. Her stomach flipped. No way. She sat up so fast that the room spun. "Tell me we didn't..." He stretched, looking entirely too satisfied for someone who had just woken up. "We did." Panic shot through her. "No, we were drunk. That doesn't count, right?" Daniel exhaled a chuckle and sat up, resting an arm over the back of the headboard. "Hate to break it to you, sweetheart, but this," he lifted his left hand, flashing a simple but unmistakable gold band on his finger, "is very real." Irene's stomach dropped. She scrambled out of bed, nearly tripping over the floor-length white dress pooled at the foot of the bed. A wedding dress. "Oh, God. Relax." He ran a hand through his dark, tousled hair, watching her with amusement. "It's not the end of the world. Not the..." She shot him an incredulous look. "We don't even know each other." Daniel smirked. "You seemed to know me well enough last night." Her face burned. "This isn't funny. We have to fix this. An annulment, divorce, whatever it takes." His smirk faded slightly as he studied her, but before he could respond, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She snatched it up and her blood turned to ice. Interview at Harrington Enterprises, 9 a.m. She checked the time, 8:15 a.m. Her stomach twisted in horror. No. Daniel arched an eyebrow. "Problem?" She whipped around, panic-stricken. "I have an interview, an important one. I have to go." Without another word, she grabbed her clothes, scrambling into them. Daniel watched her, amusement flickering in his dark eyes. "Leaving already? And here I thought you'd want to stay and celebrate our honeymoon." She glared at him, yanking on her heels. "We are getting this fixed. I don't care what it takes." Daniel didn't seem fazed. In fact, he grinned. "Sure, sweetheart. Whatever you say." Irene had no time to argue. She grabbed her purse and ran for the door, not realizing that fate wasn't done with them yet. Because in less than an hour, she'd be sitting in the lobby of Harrington Enterprises, about to meet the CEO she would be working under. And his name? Daniel Harrington. Chapter 2. Irene sprinted into Harrington Enterprises with only minutes to spare before her interview. Her heart pounded, not just from rushing, but from the absolute disaster that was her morning. A Vegas wedding? To a stranger? A cocky, arrogant stranger with a smirk that could melt glaciers? She shook her head as she stepped into the sleek, modern glass building, reminding herself that none of that mattered now. All she had to do was nail this interview, secure the job, and get the hell away from Daniel as soon as possible. The receptionist smiled at her. Miss Carter, correct? Please have a seat. Mr. Harrington will be with you shortly. Irene nodded stiffly and settled onto one of the leather chairs in the waiting area, her nerves already frayed. Harrington? The name sounded familiar, but she was too focused on steadying herself for the interview to give it much thought. She pulled out her compact mirror, horrified to see faint remnants of last night's lipstick smudged at the corner of her lips. Oh, God. Scrubbing at her face with a tissue, she tried to ignore the pounding headache and the ring still on her finger. The wedding ring. Irene sucked in a sharp breath, her stomach twisting. She had forgotten to take it off. It doesn't matter. The CEO won't notice. She took another deep breath, willing herself to focus. This interview was too important to screw up. A few minutes later, the receptionist gestured toward the large frosted glass doors at the end of the hall. You can go in now. Irene stood, straightened her blouse, and walked inside, determined to make the best impression possible. Then she froze, because the man sitting behind the massive mahogany desk was Daniel, her husband. His expression shifted from mild curiosity to sheer amusement as he leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. Well, 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 he drawled, that damn smirk already in place. Look who decided to drop by. Irene felt like she had been sucker punched. Her brain stalled, her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Daniel rose from his chair, slowly, deliberately. Didn't expect to see you again so soon, sweetheart. Her pulse hammered in her throat. This isn't happening. This isn't happening. She swallowed hard. You seem surprised. He tilted his head, his dark eyes dancing with amusement. Let me guess. You didn't know who I was when you married me last night? Irene clenched her fists, humiliation crawling up her spine. No, she had not. She had spent all night trying to forget him, only to walk straight into his office. This is a joke, right? She finally managed to say. Daniel chuckled, low and rich. No joke, though I have to admit I rather like this turn of events. Irene's stomach plummeted. She had to get out of here. I think there's been a mistake. She turned on her heel, heading for the door. But before she could take 2 steps, his voice stopped her. Oh no, sweetheart, her body stiffened. You're not going anywhere. She turned, glaring at him. Excuse me? Daniel strolled toward her, exuding a kind of authority that made the room shrink around them. You walked into my company, my office, and now you're just going to run away? I came here for a job interview. She squared her shoulders, her voice finally regaining some strength. Not to deal with this. Daniel raised an eyebrow. This? Irene gestured between them, frustration bubbling to the surface. Yes, this, whatever the hell last night was. Look, I don't know what kind of game you think this is, but we both know we need to fix this mistake. So, if you could just, I'm not fixing anything. His words were calm but firm, sending a sharp jolt through her. Her eyes snapped to his. What? Daniel took another step closer, his presence overwhelming. You might think last night was a mistake, Irene, but I don't. She felt like she had walked straight into a trap. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping. And I don't let go of things that belong to me. Belong to him? She sucked in a breath, her temper flaring past her panic. I am not your possession, she snapped, stepping back. We don't even know each other. I want an annulment, and that's final. Daniel's jaw ticked slightly, but his smirk never wavered. Oh, sweetheart. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, tapping the screen before holding it up. Her eyes widened in horror as she saw the image. A headline from a major business news outlet. Billionaire heir Daniel Harrington secretly ties the knot in Vegas. Who is the mystery bride? Irene's blood ran cold. Oh, hell, no. Her entire body locked up as the realization hit her like a freight train. This wasn't just a personal disaster, it was a public one. Daniel tucked his phone back into his pocket, watching her reaction with that infuriating smirk. An annulment? That might be a little difficult now. Irene's breath hitched. No, she shook her head. Well, fix this. We have to. Daniel's eyes darkened slightly, his smirk softening into something more dangerous. I told you, Irene, he murmured. I don't fix things I don't consider broken. And just like that, she knew. Daniel Harrington wasn't going to let her go. Chapter 3. Daniel hadn't planned on getting married in Vegas. Hell, he hadn't even planned on staying past the family dinner that had sent him over the edge in the first place. His father's voice still rang in his ears from the night before. It's time, Daniel. The board expects you to settle down. Eleanor is the perfect match. Solid family, the right connections. We're announcing the engagement next week. The engagement, the one his father arranged without his input. That's why Head gone to the club, to forget. Instead, Head met her. Irene. The woman who'd looked at him with a mix of challenge and amusement when Head offered her a drink. The woman who'd refused to fall at his feet like every other socialite Head met. The woman who, somehow, made him lose every ounce of control he prided himself on. He should have left after that first drink. Instead, he found himself drawn to her. The way she laughed, the sharp way she met his gaze without fear, the way she kept up with his teasing. One drink turned into two into hours. Hours into a whirlwind of desire, heat, and chaos. Then came the marriage. Daniel could still hear her breathless laughter as they stumbled into the tiny chapel, hands tangled together, eyes glassy from champagne and sheer adrenaline. "You're insane," she had whispered, grinning up at him as the officiant droned on. "Then you're just as insane for going along with it, sweetheart," Head shot back, tightening his grip on her waist. She hadn't pulled away. He should have known then. She was different. And now she was his wife. He woke up the next morning expecting regret, maybe even guilt. But all he felt was satisfaction, until she panicked. Daniel had never seen anyone move so fast in the morning. 1 second, she was tangled in his sheets, her bare skin still warm from the night before. The next, she was bolting for the door like the place was on fire. He should have let her go. He almost did. But then he saw her ring, his ring, still on her finger as she yanked on her clothes, and something possessive unfurled inside him. She was trying to erase what had happened. He wasn't about to let that happen. Still, he let her leave. For now. Because Daniel Harrington always got what he wanted. And he wanted her. Later that morning, the office. Daniel sat at his desk, fingers steepled as he watched the news notification on his phone. Billionaire heir Daniel Harrington secretly ties the knot in Vegas. Who is the mystery bride? The press worked fast. Not that he cared. If anything, it worked in his favor. His father had been breathing down his neck about his engagement to Eleanor for months, pressuring him to marry a woman he had no interest in. Now, the deal was off. There was no way his father could force an arranged marriage when he was already married. He smirked to himself, relishing the chaos this would cause at the next board meeting. Then his office door opened, and there she was, Irene, still breathtaking even as she froze in horror upon seeing him. Perfect. Daniel leaned back in his chair, enjoying the moment far too much. Well, he murmured, letting his gaze sweep over her. Look who decided to drop by. Her reaction was priceless. She paled. Her mouth opened, then shut, then opened again. Speechless. He tilted his head. Didn't expect to see you again so soon, sweetheart. Her breath hitched, and for a brief moment he saw something flicker across her face, something that sent a slow burn through his veins. Panic. Good. Let her squirm, but then she did something that amused him even more. She turned to leave. Daniel smirked. "Oh no, sweetheart." His voice was calm but firm. "You're not going anywhere." She stiffened. Slowly she turned back to face him, fire replacing her panic. "Excuse me?" He took his time standing, enjoying the way her breath caught slightly as he closed the space between them. "You walked into my company, my office, and now you're just going to run away?" He lifted a brow, amusement flickering in his gaze. Irene squared her shoulders, a spark of defiance flashing in her eyes. "I came here for a job interview," she bit out. "Not to deal with this." Daniel chuckled. "This?" She gestured between them, exasperation dripping from every word. "Yes, this. Whatever the hell last night was. Look, I don't know what kind of game you think this is, but we both know we need to fix this mistake. So if you could just... I'm not fixing anything." Her entire body went rigid. "What?" Daniel took another step closer, voice dropping into something dangerous, low, possessive. "You might think last night was a mistake, Irene." His lips twitched slightly. "But I don't." She sucked in a sharp breath. Daniel took his phone from his pocket and tapped the screen, then turned it toward her. Her eyes widened in horror. The headline, the story, the news had already spread. Her face drained of color as the realization hit her. "There won't be an annulment," he murmured, tucking his phone away. She staggered back, shaking her head. No. We'll fix this. We have to." Daniel's smirk faded slightly, his gaze darkening. "I told you, Irene." He stepped even closer, backing her up against his desk. I don't fix things I don't consider broken, and she was his now, whether she liked it or not. Chapter 4. Daniel had expected the fallout. He just hadn't expected it to be this entertaining. Sitting at the head of the long conference table in Harrington Enterprises boardroom, he watched with detached amusement as his father, Jonathan Harrington, paced furiously, his salt and pepper hair looking more disheveled than usual. You canceled the engagement? Jonathan's voice was sharp, slicing through the tension like a blade. Daniel took a slow sip of his coffee, entirely unfazed. That's correct. His father's nostrils flared. We had an agreement with the Kensingtons. Daniel set his coffee down and leaned back in his chair, his lips twitching. Correction. You had an agreement with the Kensingtons. I never agreed to anything. A sharp inhale came from the other end of the table, where Eleanor Kensington, the woman he was supposed to marry, sat seething. You humiliated me, she snapped, her hands curling into fists on the table. Daniel lifted a brow, completely unimpressed. You'll survive. Her face flushed red with rage, but before she could lash out, Jonathan slammed his fist against the table. Do you have any idea what you've done? His father growled. Daniel sighed. He was already bored with this conversation. I'd say I did you a favor. Eleanor and I were never going to work. Why prolong the inevitable? Jonathan's face darkened. And marrying some random woman in Vegas was a better alternative? Daniel smirked. Absolutely. A stunned silence fell over the room. He could see the headlines flashing in his father's mind. The scandal, the humiliation. Good. Jonathan's voice lowered into something lethal. Who is she? Daniel met his father's icy glare with calm defiance. My wife, Jonathan exhaled sharply. I asked you who she is, Daniel. Daniel tapped his fingers against the armrest of his chair. He could tell his father was teetering on the edge of an explosion, and he enjoyed watching him lose control. She's none of your concern, Daniel said smoothly. Eleanor let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Oh, she's definitely our concern now, Daniel. Do you even know what you've done? The Kensingtons will... Get over it, Daniel interrupted, his voice firm. Jonathan's jaw tightened, his frustration palpable. I will not have this company suffer because of your reckless decisions. You will fix this. Daniel tilted his head slightly. And how exactly do you expect me to do that? You'll end it. Daniel laughed outright, shaking his head. Jonathan wasn't amused. You'll get a divorce, Daniel. His father's voice was final, commanding. Daniel's amusement vanished. He leaned forward, his calm, cold gaze locking onto his father's. No. Silence. Tension thickened in the room. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly as if she'd just realized he wasn't joking. Jonathan's jaw twitched. Excuse me? Daniel held his ground. You heard me, though. There will be no divorce. Jonathan's hand curled into a fist, his anger barely contained. You think you can just do whatever the hell you want? Yes. Daniel's tone was unapologetic. His father's face darkened with rage. And what happens when this woman of yours... What's her name? Irene. When she leaves, when she runs for the hills the moment she realizes what she's gotten herself into. A dangerous smirk tugged at Daniel's lips. She won't, Jonathan scoffed. And why is that? Daniel stood, buttoning his suit jacket with unhurried ease. Because, father, he said, his voice calm, but final, I don't intend to let her go. And with that, he walked out of the boardroom, leaving behind absolute chaos. Irene had spent the entire day in damage control mode. After the disastrous morning at Harrington Enterprises, she had called Maya in a panic, nearly hyperventilating as she paced around her tiny apartment. You married Daniel Harrington? Maya had screeched through the phone. By accident, Irene had shot back, gripping her forehead. She had spent the rest of the day trying to process the nightmare she was now living in. But now she was exhausted. She had just stepped out of the shower, wrapped in a towel, when a loud knock echoed through her apartment. Irene frowned. It was late. Who the hell? She pulled open the door and froze. Daniel stood there, leaning lazily against the doorframe, looking completely at ease in his dark suit, his tie loosened just enough to look both dangerous and devastatingly attractive. Her stomach plummeted. What the hell are you doing here? She demanded. Daniel's eyes flicked over her, his gaze lingering on the towel she had wrapped around herself. His smirk was slow, deliberate. Nice outfit, sweetheart. Irene slammed the door in his face. Or at least, she tried. Daniel's foot stopped it mid-close, his strength unwavering as he pushed it open just enough to meet her glare. Not in the mood for company, she snapped, gripping the towel tighter. Come back never. Daniel chuckled. We need to talk. We have nothing to talk about. Oh, we do. His voice dropped, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. And I suggest you invite me in before we start discussing our marriage in front of your neighbors. Irene's stomach clenched. She hated that he was right. With a frustrated sigh, she stepped back, allowing him inside. Daniel strode in like he owned the place, his gaze sweeping over the small apartment. Cozy. Irene crossed her arms. Say what you came to say and get out. Daniel turned to her, his expression suddenly serious. No annulment, her breath caught. Excuse me? He took a step closer. You heard me. We're not ending this marriage. Irene stared at him, stunned. Are you insane? His lips curved slightly. Probably. She let out a sharp breath. This isn't funny, Daniel. I'm not laughing. His dark eyes pinned her in place. I don't want this, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Daniel's gaze didn't waver. Then I guess you'll just have to deal with it, he murmured. Irene's heart slammed against her ribs, because for the first time since waking up that morning, since realizing what they had done, she finally understood something terrifying. Daniel Harrington wasn't going to let her go. And worse, somewhere deep down, a part of her wasn't sure she wanted him to. Chapter 5. Irene refused to be trapped. Not in this situation, not by him. She glared at Daniel, who was standing far too comfortably in her living room, his broad frame dominating the small space. He had the audacity to look amused, as if the entire situation was nothing more than an interesting turn of events. I don't know what kind of sick game this is, she said, crossing her arms, her towel still wrapped tightly around her. But I'm not playing. Daniel's lips twitched, his dark eyes watching her far too closely. You think this is a game, isn't it? She snapped. You waltz in here acting like you get to make decisions for both of us, as if last night means anything. He moved. 1 second, he was standing near her couch. The next, he was right in front of her, his body heat searing through the small distance between them. Irene's breath hitched, her heart slamming against her ribs. Daniel tilted his head, his voice dangerously soft. You think last night meant nothing? She refused to let him intimidate her. It was a mistake, she said, her voice sharper than she felt. And I want out, Daniel's jaw ticked, but his expression remained infuriatingly calm. Too bad, her fingers clenched into fists. Too bad? She repeated, disbelief lacing her tone. You heard me. Daniel, she started, her patience snapping. I don't care who you are, I don't care how much money you have, and I don't care what your family expects from you. I don't want to be your wife. Something flickered in his midnight eyes. Something dangerous. You don't want to be my wife, he repeated slowly, like he was testing the words. That's right. Daniel exhaled a slow breath, his gaze dropping to her lips for a fraction of a second before returning to her eyes. Irene, his voice was smooth, deep, and unshakable. Let's get something straight. She stiffened. I don't let go of things that belong to me. Her pulse skipped. I don't belong to you. She shot back. His smirk returned, slow and lethal. You sure about that? Irene's stomach clenched as he lifted his hand, slow, deliberate, and ran his fingertips down her bare arm. A spark. That was the only way to describe it. A slow, burning spark that trailed down her skin, sending her nerves into overdrive. Irene jerked back like she had been burned. Don't touch me, Daniel chuckled, dark and knowing. Still feel nothing? He murmured. She hated how her body reacted to him. The memory of his hands on her, the way his mouth had devoured her the night before, the way she had moaned his name in a tangle of sheets and heat. No, 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 no. Irene shoved those thoughts away and lifted her chin defiantly. This, she gestured between them, was a drunken mistake, and as soon as I can, I'm getting an annulment. Daniel exhaled slowly, watching her as if deciding something. Then in a voice too calm, he said, That won't be possible. Her stomach dropped. What do you mean that won't be possible? She demanded. Daniel reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped the screen. A moment later, he turned it toward her. Her heart stopped. The screen displayed a legal document, an official marriage certificate, and beneath it, a contract. Irene's breath caught. What? What is this? She whispered. Daniel's smirk was pure sin. Our prenuptial agreement, her head snapped up. Prenuptial what? We didn't sign anything. Oh, we did, Daniel said smoothly. The chapel we got married in had a standard prenup clause. They had us sign it while we were occupied. Her blood ran cold. No. No, no, no. Good news, he continued, like he hadn't just shattered her escape plan, is that it protects you financially. She didn't care about the money. What's the bad news, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel leaned in, his lips a breath away from hers. The bad news, sweetheart, he murmured, his voice like a slow seduction, is that it states we can't get an annulment. Only a divorce. Her stomach twisted violently. A divorce. Not an annulment. That meant, which means, Daniel continued, brushing a strand of damp hair from her face, we're married for at least a year. Irene sucked in a breath, her body going rigid. A year. Her knees nearly gave out. You're lying, she whispered. Daniel's smirk didn't waver. Call my lawyer if you don't believe me. Irene's heart pounded. This couldn't be real, this couldn't be happening, but the look in Daniel's dark, knowing gaze told her otherwise. It was real, and he wasn't letting her go. Chapter 6. Irene needed a way out. As soon as Daniel left, she ripped through the prenuptial agreement, scanning every word, desperate for a loophole. There had to be a way to annul this nightmare. There had to be. But the more she read, the colder her stomach became. Daniel wasn't lying. The Vegas chapel had covered its bases. Due to state marriage laws, the only way to end this was a divorce, but there was a mandatory 1-year waiting period before either of them could file. 1 whole year. Irene threw the papers onto the couch, pressing her fingers against her temple. This wasn't happening. It was supposed to be one wild night, a mistake, not a marriage with a billionaire who refused to let her go. Her phone buzzed. Maya. Irene swiped to answer. Maya, I'm losing my mind. Oh, babe, I saw the news, Maya groaned. You married Daniel Harrington? The Daniel Harrington? Irene flopped onto the couch, staring at the ceiling. It was an accident, Maya snorted. You don't accidentally marry a billionaire, babe. That takes commitment. Irene let out a frustrated groan. It was one night. We were drunk. We don't even know each other. Yeah, well, you're trending right now. Mystery wife of billionaire Daniel Harrington. The internet is obsessed with you. Irene sat up abruptly. I'm what? Your face is all over social media, girl. I mean, I got to admit, you do look hot in the wedding pictures. But, you might want to lay low for a bit. Irene clutched her head. This just kept getting worse. Okay, fine. So it'll just get an annulment and disappear. Silence. Yeah, Maya muttered. About that, Irene froze. What? Maya sighed. Babe, Daniel just made a statement. Irene's stomach dropped. What? Did he say? She could hear Maya wince over the phone. He told the press that you're his wife, and he has no intention of letting you go. Irene's entire body stiffened. Her phone nearly slipped from her grip. He what? She whispered, her voice dangerously low. Yeah. And now everyone thinks you two are like madly in love or something. They're calling it the Vegas love story. Honestly, it's kinda romantic. Irene wanted to scream. He's insane, Maya hummed thoughtfully. Or maybe he's obsessed with you. Irene groaned loudly. Not helping Maya. She ended the call, her mind racing. She needed to fix this. She needed to end this. And if Daniel Harrington thought he could trap her in this marriage, he was about to learn the hard way. Irene Carter didn't play by anyone's rules. Daniel was expecting her, which is why, when his office doors slammed open, he barely flinched. Irene stormed inside, fire in her eyes, a fury of beauty and chaos. He smirked. Ah, my wife. She threw a folder onto his desk. We need to talk. Daniel leaned back in his chair, amused. You look upset, Irene glared at him. You went to the press? He shrugged. They were going to find out anyway. You told them you had no intention of letting me go, his lips curved. Because I don't, Irene threw her hands up. You're insane, Daniel chuckled. You keep saying that. Because it's true, I want out of this marriage, Daniel. He tilted his head. Do you? Yes, he smirked. Then why are you still wearing my ring? Irene froze. Her eyes darted down to her left hand. The wedding ring? She had been so distracted, so furious, she hadn't even taken it off. Her face flushed as she yanked it off her finger, slamming it onto his desk. There. Fixed. Daniel's smirk didn't falter. Still doesn't change anything, he said smoothly. You're still my wife. Her jaw clenched. Not for long. Daniel exhaled, pushing back from his chair and rising to his full height. Slowly, he walked around his desk, closing the space between them. Irene stepped back instinctively, but he reached for her hand, catching her wrist before she could retreat. Her pulse quickened. His fingers brushed against her skin, slow, deliberate. Irene. His voice was low, deep, dangerous. You can fight me all you want, but the reality is, you're mine now. Her breath hitched. I am not yours, she said, her voice firm, but not as steady as she wanted it to be. Daniel's gaze darkened, his grip tightening just slightly. Then why? He murmured, leaning closer. Do you look like you're waiting for me to kiss you? Irene's stomach twisted. She wasn't. Was she? Daniel smirked, like he could read her mind. I can wait, sweetheart, he murmured, because whether you like it or not, you belong to me now. Irene snatched her hand away, taking a sharp step back. This isn't over, she hissed. Daniel chuckled. No, it isn't. She spun on her heel and stormed out. Daniel watched her go, his smirk widening. She could run all she wanted. But she wasn't going anywhere. Chapter 7. Running won't save you. Irene had one plan: get out of Vegas before Daniel could stop her. She had booked a last-minute flight, packed her suitcase, and was already in the back of a cab, heading straight for the airport. This was her chance, her only chance. She couldn't stay here, not when Daniel was determined to keep her, not when her own body betrayed her every time he was near. She clenched her fists as the city lights blurred past the window. Just a few more minutes and she'd be free, away from him, away from the way he looked at her, away from the way her pulse skipped when he said mine. Her phone buzzed, and she ignored it. Then, another buzz. Incoming call. Daniel Harrington. Irene hesitated. If she didn't answer, he'd just show up. With a frustrated sigh, she pressed accept. What? Silence. Then, in a voice too calm, Daniel said, Turn around, Irene. Her stomach plummeted. He knew. She swallowed hard, forcing steel into her voice. I'm not turning around. Really? His voice was smooth, lazy. So, you think you're just going to fly out of Vegas without a problem? Irene's grip tightened on her phone. You can't stop me. Oh, sweetheart. His chuckle was dark, full of amusement. You really think I wouldn't be prepared for this? A chill ran down her spine. Then, the cab suddenly slowed to a stop. Her head snapped up. Why are we stopping? The driver glanced at her through the mirror, looking nervous. Ma'am, I was told to pull over. Irene's heart pounded. What? And then the door swung open, and Daniel slid inside, completely at ease. Her breath caught. He was in a three-piece suit, his tie loosened just enough to look effortlessly powerful, his dark eyes sharp with amusement. Irene stared at him, stunned. He tapped the screen of his phone, showing her a flight itinerary. Her flight canceled. Her stomach dropped. Her voice came out shaky, disbelieving. You canceled my flight? Daniel leaned back against the seat, his smirk slow, dangerous. I own the airline, sweetheart. Irene sucked in a breath. He owned the airline. She was going to kill him. You can't just... Oh, I can, he murmured. Her chest heaved as she glared at him. I hate you. Daniel tilted his head, studying her. Then, in a voice too soft, he said, No, you don't. Her pulse skipped. Damn him. Damn the way he made her feel. Damn the way her traitorous body reacted to him. She turned away, staring out the window, her heart pounding. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. Let's go, sweetheart. She didn't move. Go where? He smirked. Home. Daniel's penthouse. Late night. Daniel's pee. Daniel watched Irene pace his penthouse, arms crossed, her frustration rolling off her in waves. You can't keep me here, she snapped, spinning to face him. Daniel leaned against the counter, completely unbothered. Irene, his voice was calm, patient, like he was dealing with a wild animal. I mean it, Daniel, she pointed at him. This kidnapping bullshit is insane, Daniel smirked. Kidnapping, sweetheart, I canceled your flight, not threw you in a trunk. Her eyes narrowed. That's next, isn't it? He laughed, pushing off the counter. Not if you behave. Her cheeks flushed, and that was when he knew. She wasn't just angry, she was flustered. It made something dark, primal, coil in his chest. She could fight all she wanted, but she wasn't running anymore, and deep down she felt this pull, too. Daniel took a slow step toward her, then another. Irene stood her ground, but her breath hitched as he got closer. Why are you really running? He murmured. She lifted her chin. Because you're impossible. Daniel smirked. Try again, she scowled. Because I want my life back. He reached for her hand, lifting it slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. His fingers traced along her bare ring finger and met where his wedding band used to be. You didn't answer my question, sweetheart. Irene swallowed hard, her pulse thrumming against his fingertips. Tell me, he whispered, his voice thick with something she couldn't name. What are you really afraid of? Her breath shuddered. She hated this, hated the way he unraveled her, hated the way he made her want to lean in. Her eyes flickered to his lips, just for a second. And that was all Daniel needed. He closed the distance between them, his hands slipping to her waist, pulling her closer. Irene sucked in a sharp breath, their bodies pressed together, heat sparking between them. She should push him away, she should run again, but instead, her fingers curled into his shirt. Daniel tilted her chin up, his thumb tracing the edge of her jaw. His voice was gravel and silk, low and commanding. "Tell me to stop." Irene's lips parted, but the words wouldn't come, because she didn't want him to. Daniel's smirk faded, his dark gaze locking onto hers, and then he kissed her, and Irene fell. Chapter 8. The first thing Irene felt when she woke up was warmth. Not the kind that came from a blanket or a morning sunbeam filtering through the window, but the kind that came from him. Her breath hitched as she realized she wasn't alone in bed. Daniel's arm was draped possessively around her waist, his fingers resting on her bare skin. Her bare skin. Her eyes flew open. Oh, hell. The memories from last night crashed into her. His hands, his mouth, the way he had pinned her to the wall, whispering sinful promises against her skin. The way she had let him. The way she had wanted him. Irene's stomach twisted. This was not supposed to happen. She shifted slightly, trying to untangle herself from him without waking him up. But the moment she moved, Daniel's grip tightened. "Where do you think you're going, sweetheart?" Her heart leaped into her throat. His voice was rough, sleep-heavy, but his hold was firm, like he had no intention of letting her slip away. Irene squeezed her eyes shut, forcing herself to stay calm. "This was a mistake," she muttered. Daniel chuckled, his warm breath brushing against her ear. "Didn't feel like a mistake last night." Her cheeks burned. She twisted in his grip, meeting his dark, lazy gaze. "Last night was..." She searched for the right word. Daniel lifted an eyebrow. "Incredible? Mind-blowing?" She glared. "A lapse in judgment." His smirk widened. "I see. So, you were moaning my name all night because of a lapse in judgment?" Irene shoved his chest, forcing herself free from his grip. "You're impossible." She threw the blanket off and scrambled out of bed, reaching for her discarded clothes. Daniel propped himself up on one elbow, watching her with pure amusement. "You know you're welcome to stay in my bed as long as you like." Irene snatched her blouse off the floor. "I'm leaving." Daniel sighed dramatically, leaning back against the pillows. "Running again, sweetheart?" Irene froze. His words hit her right in the chest. Because wasn't that exactly what she was doing? Again? She had been running from him, from this marriage, from the way he made her feel. Her jaw tightened. She wasn't running, not this time. She turned back to face him, lifting her chin. "I'm not running," Daniel smirked. "Then stay." Irene rolled her eyes. "I meant, I'm going to handle things my way." Daniel's eyes darkened slightly. "And what exactly does that mean?" "It means I'm going to take back control of my life. I'm done playing your game." Daniel studied her, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he grinned. "Good," he murmured. "I'd be disappointed if you gave in too easily." Irene's heart skipped a beat. Damn him. Daniel knew this moment would come. He had barely stepped into the grand estate before his father's voice boomed across the room. "Daniel, we need to talk." Daniel sighed, rolling his shoulders back. He had been expecting this ever since the press got wind of his Vegas wedding. Jonathan Harrington, patriarch, CEO, and an absolute control freak, stood at the head of the room, arms crossed, his expression a mix of fury and disbelief. Across from him, his mother, Margaret Harrington, sat gracefully in her chair, her eyes sharp with curiosity. And beside her, Eleanor Kensington. Daniel barely resisted the urge to groan. Eleanor shot him a venomous glare, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the table. "You must be joking," Jonathan snapped. "A Vegas wedding? To a woman no one even knows?" Daniel strolled inside, completely unbothered, and took a seat at the table. "I'm touched, Father. I didn't know you cared so much about my love life." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "You know damn well this isn't about love. It's about business. And you just threw away an alliance with the Kensingtons." Daniel glanced at Eleanor, his smirk sharp. "Oh, what a tragedy." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "You humiliated me," Daniel shrugged. "Trust me, Eleanor, you'll recover." Jonathan slammed his fist against the table. "You will fix this." Daniel's calm demeanor didn't waver. "No," he said simply. Silence crashed over the room. Jonathan's face darkened. "Excuse me?" I said no. Daniel leaned back, completely at ease. "Irene is my wife, and that isn't changing." Margaret finally spoke, her voice smooth, elegant. "And what exactly do you plan to do with her, Daniel?" Daniel's gaze hardened. Whatever I want. Jonathan let out a sharp breath, pinching the bridge of his nose. You do realize what you've done, don't you? The board is questioning your judgment. Investors are wary. And the Kensingtons. Daniel waved a hand dismissively. The Kensingtons will find another fool to manipulate. Eleanor's nostrils flared. You're a bastard, Daniel, he grinned. You knew that before you agreed to marry me. Margaret sipped her tea, unfazed. And what about your wife, Daniel? What does Irene think of all this? Daniel's smirk faltered slightly. Irene? She had been fighting him since the moment she realized who he was. And yet, she had let him kiss her last night. She had clung to him, melted against him. But would she stay? Would she fight back harder? Daniel's eyes darkened. Good. He didn't want her to break. He wanted her to fight. Because the truth was, no matter how much Irene tried to deny it, she was his. And he wasn't letting her go. Chapter 9. Irene was done being controlled. For the past 48 hours, her life had been nothing but chaos. A Vegas wedding she didn't remember. A billionaire husband who refused to let her go. And now, his family breathing down her neck, waiting for her to break. She wouldn't. Not now. Not ever. Which was why she walked into Harrington Enterprises with her head held high, ready to deal with the media storm on her terms. The second she entered the lobby, whispers erupted around her. The billionaire's mystery wife. She ignored them, stepping into the executive elevator, hitting the button for Daniel's office. The doors closed. A breath. Steady yourself, Irene. This wasn't just about escaping him anymore. This was about winning. Daniel knew Irene would come, had been waiting. So when the office doors swung open and she strode inside with fire in her eyes, he simply smirked. There's my wife, he murmured, leaning back in his chair. Irene's jaw clenched. We need to talk. Daniel gestured lazily to the chair across from him. By all means, sweetheart. She didn't sit. Instead, she slapped a folder onto his desk, her voice sharp. I want control over my own life. Daniel arched a brow, flipping it open. It was a proposal, a contract. She had written out terms, boundaries she wanted to set in place. No forced appearances, no interference with her career, no physical contact unless she initiated it. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. You're negotiating with me? Irene crossed her arms, her chin lifting. If you want me to stay, it has to be on my terms. His eyes darkened. You think I won't break you, Irene? She didn't even flinch. You think he'll let you? She shot back. Daniel stared at her for a long moment, amusement flickering in his gaze. Damn, she was perfect. But she had one fatal flaw. She thought she could win against him. Daniel slowly stood, rounding the desk, closing the space between them. Irene stiffened, but she held her ground. His fingers brushed along her jawline, his voice dropping. You want control, sweetheart? She swallowed hard. Yes, his smirk was lethal. Then let's see how long you last. The last thing Irene wanted was to be paraded around like Daniel's trophy wife. But with the press breathing down their necks, they had no choice but to make an appearance. The charity gala was a spectacle of wealth and power. The moment they arrived, cameras flashed, and murmurs followed them. There they are. He looks completely obsessed with her. Look at the way he's holding her. Irene tried to ignore it, tried to focus on keeping her distance, but Daniel wasn't playing fair. His hand settled possessively on her lower back, guiding her through the crowd. His touch seared through her dress, making her pulse jump. And when the first interviewer approached, microphone in hand, Daniel did the unthinkable. He pulled her flush against him, his lips brushing against her ear. Smile, sweetheart. And then he kissed her, right there, in front of everyone. A slow, possessive kiss that sent the entire room into chaos. Irene's mind short-circuited. The heat, the way he owned the moment, the way he took her breath away. And the worst part? She kissed him back. Because damn him, Daniel Harrington knew exactly how to ruin her. And now there was no escaping him. Chapter 10. Irene should have pushed him away. She should have pulled back, turned her head, done something to stop the possessive, devastatingly public kiss that Daniel had just planted on her lips. But she didn't. Because the moment his mouth met hers, her entire body betrayed her. The way he held her, the way his fingers curled around her waist, the way his lips moved with purpose, with ownership. It was enough to send her pulse spiraling out of control. And the worst part? She kissed him back, for a second. Just a single damn second before she realized what she was doing. Irene jerked away, her breath ragged, her cheeks burning under the glare of flashing cameras. But Daniel was calm, collected, his smirk taunting, like he knew exactly what he had done, like he knew he had just won a battle she didn't even know they were fighting. The crowd erupted. Did you see that? That wasn't for the cameras. That was real. Hes obsessed with her. Irene's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a kiss, it was a claim, a warning to everyone watching, including her. You belong to me, sweetheart. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She needed to get out of here. Now. Irene forced a smile, ignoring the way her lips still tingled. She turned to the cameras, her voice steady but sharp. Well, she said, I suppose that answers any questions about our marriage. Laughter rippled through the crowd, but she didn't wait for another question. Instead, she spun on her heel and walked away. And Daniel? Daniel let her go, for now. Daniel wasn't surprised when Irene stormed into his penthouse later that night, rage burning in her eyes. She had lasted longer than he expected. What the hell was that? She demanded, throwing her purse onto the couch. Daniel, who had been pouring himself a drink, didn't even look up. A kiss, he said smoothly. You've had one before, haven't you, sweetheart? Irene's hands curled into fists. That wasn't just a kiss, she snapped. That was you staking a claim. Daniel smirked, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. I don't recall you complaining. Her face flushed, her breath shaky. You did that on purpose. Of course I did. He finally turned to her, his dark eyes glinting with satisfaction. And it worked. Her jaw tightened. What the hell does that mean? Daniel took a slow sip of his drink, then set it down before closing the space between them. It means, he murmured, voice dangerously low, that you just solidified this marriage. Irene froze. What? Daniel reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and turned the screen toward her. Her stomach dropped. The headline screamed at her. Daniel Harrington and his wife share a passionate kiss. Is their marriage the real deal? And below it, a video clip of their kiss. Irene felt lightheaded, the way he had held her, the way she had melted into him, the way it looked like they were utterly in love, the way the world believed it. Daniel watched her reaction with quiet amusement. Congratulations, sweetheart, he murmured. You're officially stuck with me. Irene's breath hitched, because he was right. There was no escaping this now. Irene had barely had time to recover from the media explosion before Daniel's family demanded a meeting, which was why she now sat at the head of a long dining table across from Margaret and Jonathan Harrington, Daniel's parents, and, of course, Eleanor Kensington, his almost fiancée. Irene lifted her coffee cup, pretending she wasn't utterly exhausted. Margaret was the first to speak. Well, she said smoothly, watching Irene over the rim of her own cup, I suppose congratulations are in order. Irene forced a smile. Thank you. Margaret tilted her head. So tell me, Irene, how does it feel to be married to a man you barely know? Irene's grip tightened around her cup. She refused to look at Daniel. She refused to let them see the cracks. So instead, she met Margaret's gaze head-on. I think it's working out just fine, she said, her voice syrupy sweet. Margaret smiled. Eleanor, however, laughed bitterly. Oh, please, she snapped, crossing her arms. We all know this marriage is a joke. Irene's spine stiffened. Eleanor's eyes flashed with fury. You think this is real? She scoffed. You think Daniel actually cares about you? Irene's stomach twisted. But before she could respond, Daniel set his glass down with a sharp clink. Careful, Eleanor, he said, his voice low, warning. Eleanor's nostrils flared. Oh, what? You're going to defend her now? Daniel leaned forward, his expression ice-cold. I don't repeat myself, he murmured. Irene is my wife, and you will show her respect. The room fell silent. Margaret watched, her lips curving slightly. Eleanor? Eleanor looked like she wanted to set something on fire. Irene's breath was unsteady, because Daniel wasn't just protecting her. He was claiming her. And the worst part, it felt dangerously good. Chapter 11. Irene never agreed to move in with Daniel, but it wasn't her choice anymore. After the gala, the media explosion, and the sudden meeting with his family, she barely had time to breathe before Daniel made his next move. You're moving in with me, he had said that night, his voice calm, commanding. She had laughed in his face. Like hell I am. Daniel had simply smirked. Sweetheart, you have two options, move in voluntarily, or I have security pack your things and bring you to the penthouse. Your choice. And just like that, she was trapped. Irene stood in the massive bedroom, staring out the glass window overlooking the city. Daniel was somewhere downstairs, handling business calls, but she could still feel his presence everywhere. His scent, his heat, his power. She needed to get out. This marriage was a game to him, a power move. And yet, the worst part, she wasn't fighting anymore. Her body had already betrayed her, over and over again. And now, she was stuck under the same roof as the man she couldn't resist. She let out a sharp breath, pressing a hand to her stomach. Something felt off, dizzy, weak, unsettled. Maybe it was just stress. Maybe. The thought vanished when she heard the door creak open behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The air shifted. The room felt smaller. Then, his voice, low, rough. "You should be in bed." Irene's fingers curled into fists. "I don't take orders from you." Daniel chuckled darkly. "You sure about that?" She turned, glaring at him, but her breath hitched at the look in his eyes. Hungry, possessive, dangerous. The same way he had looked at her the night he kissed her in front of the world. The same way he had looked at her before he ruined her in his bed. A slow, predatory smirk curled on his lips. Then, he took a step closer. Irene backed up, but the wall stopped her. Trapped. Daniel's hands caged her in, his voice brushing against her ear. "You're mine, Irene," he murmured. "You can fight all you want, but in the end, you'll always end up here." She hated how right he was. And the worst part? She wasn't sure she wanted to run anymore. Something was wrong. For the past few days, Irene had been sick. Nausea, weakness, a constant, heavy feeling in her stomach. She had blamed it on stress, on Daniel, on everything except the truth. But now, as she stood in the bathroom staring at the pregnancy test, she couldn't run anymore. 2 red lines. Positive, her heart slammed against her ribs. She was pregnant, with Daniel's child. Her breath hitched, her hands shaking. No, this wasn't happening. She wasn't ready. She couldn't be pregnant, not with his baby. A sharp knock on the door snapped her out of it. Irene, Daniel's voice was sharp, impatient. "Open the door." She panicked. She couldn't tell him. Not yet. Not when she didn't even know what to do. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice unsteady. Silence. Then the door swung open. Daniel's eyes locked onto her. Then, down to the pregnancy test in her trembling hands. The room fell silent. His expression went blank. Then his jaw tensed, his voice low. "You're pregnant. Not a question. A fact." Irene swallowed hard. "Daniel, But before she could speak, he closed the distance, his body pressing into hers, his hand resting on her stomach. Her breath hitched. His voice was low, dark, terrifyingly certain. "You're not going anywhere now, sweetheart." And just like that, she knew. There was no escaping him anymore. Chapter 12. Irene had never felt so trapped in her life. Everywhere she turned, Daniel was there. His presence, his control, his ownership of her life. She should have been able to get out, to walk away. But she couldn't. Not now. Not with the child growing inside her. Her stomach twisted with fear as she sat in the penthouse, staring out the window. The skyline was beautiful, but nothing about her life felt beautiful anymore. The truth was undeniable. She was pregnant. Pregnant with Daniel Harrington's child. The very thought made her feel sick. She had tried to ignore it. She had tried to hide the truth. But every time she woke up, every time she felt the slightest nudge in her stomach, the reality sank deeper into her bones. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't run. Irene closed her eyes, gripping the edge of the window, trying to steady her breath. You have to leave. You have to fight. But deep down, she knew she wasn't going anywhere. Not unless Daniel allowed it. The thought of his hands on her, the way he had possessed her over and over again, made her feel both repulsed and drawn to him. She hated it. But the truth was, she was in his world now, and she hated herself for it. Daniel knew something was off the second he walked through the door. Irene had been quiet, her eyes distant, as if something was weighing on her. And then he saw it, the pregnancy test she had tried to hide, lying on the bathroom counter. He had been avoiding bringing it up, but he knew, he always knew, she was carrying his child. The moment his gaze landed on the test, he could feel a satisfaction ripple through him. She was his. She had always been his. And now this child would tie her to him forever. Irene, he called, his voice calm, dark. She didn't respond. He walked into the living room, finding her standing by the window, her face blank, distant. "I'm not blind," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "I know what's going on." Irene turned slightly, her eyes avoiding his. Her silence made him angry. "You don't get to run, sweetheart." His voice was low, commanding, like a warning. "You're carrying my child. That means you're staying." Irene's eyes flashed with frustration. but she didn't answer. She just turned away. Daniel stepped forward, his hand on her shoulder, spinning her back to face him. "You will stay with me," he said, his voice thick with authority. "You have no choice now." Irene's lips parted, but before she could speak, the doorbell rang. Daniel glared in annoyance. "Don't think I'm done with you," he muttered under his breath. He opened the door, expecting nothing more than a delivery or a visitor. But standing in the doorway, with malice in her eyes, was Eleanor Kensington. Irene's eyes widened in shock. Eleanor gave a thin, cold smile as she stepped inside, her gaze never leaving Irene. "You must be Irene," she said, her voice dripping with icy disdain. "I hope you're enjoying your time with Daniel, but don't get too comfortable." Irene stiffened. She didn't need to hear Eleanor's threats, she had heard enough of them already. But this time Eleanor wasn't hiding her intentions. "You think you've won, don't you?" Eleanor continued, her eyes now turning to Daniel, who stood behind Irene, a glimmer of amusement in his expression. "But I'm not done yet." Irene felt the danger in Eleanor's words, her chest tightening. Before Daniel could respond, Eleanor stepped forward, her voice sharp. "You're going to regret this, Irene. You have no idea what you've just walked into. You think Daniel wants you? You're nothing but a pawn in his game." Irene took a step back, her hands shaking slightly, but she refused to show weakness. "I don't need your approval, Eleanor," Irene snapped. "And I don't care about your games," Eleanor's smile twisted. "You'll care when everything you've built comes crashing down, when Daniel decides you're not worth the trouble anymore." Irene's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't flinch. Daniel's hand fell on her shoulder, and she immediately felt a rush of heat. But it wasn't comfort, it was dominance. Eleanor stared at them both, her eyes filled with jealousy. "We'll see about that." She turned on her heel, storming out the door. Irene felt her stomach churn. She had expected Eleanor to be bitter. But not like this. The woman was dangerous and vindictive. Daniel closed the door behind Eleanor, his jaw tight. "She won't be a problem." But Irene wasn't so sure. She turned to him, her voice steely. "Don't ever let her near me again, Daniel. She's not just trying to break us apart. She wants to destroy me." Daniel's expression softened, but only slightly. "She won't," he said with unshakable confidence. "Not if I have anything to say about it." But Irene couldn't help but wonder. Could Daniel really protect her from Eleanor's wrath? Or was she already losing the game? Chapter 13. Irene had spent weeks fighting Daniel Harrington. Fighting the control, the power, the overwhelming pull he had on her. But she was tired of running, tired of pretending, and most of all, tired of denying what was already hers. Because no matter how much she fought it, she belonged to him, and deep down, she wanted to belong to him. For the first time since their marriage, she stopped resisting. She let herself feel it, the way his hands possessed her, the way his eyes devoured her, the way his touch burned through her skin, making her forget everything except him. She loved him. She had tried to fight it, but the truth was impossible to ignore. She was his, completely, irrevocably his, and he was hers. No matter how dark, no matter how dangerous, no matter how much he consumed her, she wanted it. She wanted him. So she stopped fighting, and for the first time she let herself fall. Daniel knew something had changed the moment he walked into the bedroom. Irene was waiting for him. Not angry, not defiant, not running. She was waiting. For him. For this. He let the silence stretch between them, watching her, waiting for her to speak. But instead, she closed the space between them and pressed her lips to his. Daniel stilled. Because this time it wasn't a fight for dominance. This time, she wasn't running. This time, she was giving in. His grip tightened around her waist, pulling her closer, deepening the kiss, taking everything she was offering. Her hands curled into his shirt, desperate, needy, her body pressing into his as if she was finally claiming him the way he had claimed her. She pulled back just enough to whisper against his lips. "I'm done fighting." Daniel's breath caught. Her eyes, dark, full of something he had never seen before, searched his. And then, "I love you, Daniel." His entire world stopped. For the first time in his life, he felt something shift inside him. Because she meant it. She was his now, not just in body, not just in name, but in every way that mattered. Daniel didn't speak. He didn't have to. Instead, he devoured her, kissing her like he was starving for her, like he had been waiting for this moment his entire life. And maybe he had, because Irene was his, and now she finally knew it too. For the first time since this nightmare started, Irene felt at peace. She woke up in Daniel's arms, his hand resting protectively over her stomach. Their child. Her heart clenched. She had spent so long trying to fight this, trying to escape him. But she didn't want to escape anymore. She had everything she had ever wanted: love, security, passion, and him. She turned in his arms, pressing a soft kiss to his jaw. Daniel's eyes opened instantly, his grip tightening around her. "Morning, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice gravel and silk. Irene smiled. "Morning." His dark gaze searched hers, and for once, she didn't look away. "I meant what I said last night," she whispered. His jaw tightened, his fingers brushing against her cheek. "I know." And then, for the first time, Daniel let himself say the words he had never said before. "I love you too." Irene's breath hitched, her chest tightening, because for the first time she wasn't afraid of loving him. She was ready to be his. Chapter 14. Irene had never felt safer than she did in Daniel's arms. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't afraid. She wasn't running. She had given in, accepted everything: the love, the darkness, the power that came with being Daniel Harrington's wife. But peace was never meant to last, because as soon as she stepped into the lobby of Harrington Enterprises that morning, her entire world shattered. The massive LED screen in the center of the lobby was broadcasting live news, and at the bottom of the screen her name flashed in bold red letters. Scandal. Billionaire's wife's secret past. Who is the woman Daniel Harrington married? Irene's stomach plummeted. Her hands trembled as she read the words, barely able to breathe as the reporter spoke. Sources reveal shocking details about Irene Carter, the mysterious woman who married billionaire Daniel Harrington in a sudden Vegas wedding. But what she's been hiding will leave you speechless. Then the worst part: photos of her. Not just her, but her with her ex-boyfriend. The man she had once loved. The man who had ruined her. Irene froze, her pulse thundering in her ears, because she knew exactly who had done this. Eleanor. And she hadn't just exposed Irene. She had gone after her in the most personal, brutal way. A familiar, terrifying voice echoed from behind her. "Surprised, sweetheart?" Irene turned slowly, her blood running ice-cold. Eleanor stood there, smirking, her expensive designer dress hugging her frame as she watched Irene fall apart. "I warned you," Eleanor said softly, tilting her head. "You didn't listen." Irene's fists clenched. "You have no idea what you've done." Eleanor laughed coldly. "Oh, I think I do." She took a step closer, her voice dropping into something low and venomous. "You think you can just waltz into Daniel's life, take what's mine, and live happily ever after?" Eleanor's smile twisted. "You have no idea what war looks like." Irene's heart pounded, her breath shaky. This wasn't just a game to Eleanor. This was a declaration of war, and she had no idea how far Eleanor was willing to go. Daniel knew something was wrong the moment Irene stormed into his office. Her face was pale, her hands shaking, but her eyes were burning with fury. He stood immediately. "What happened?" Irene threw her phone onto his desk. "She went after me." Daniel glanced at the screen, and everything inside him went cold. The headlines, the photos, the lies. Eleanor had gone too far. Way, way too far. Daniel's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. She thought she could destroy Irene. She thought she could hurt what belonged to him. She was about to find out just how big of a mistake she had made. Daniel looked at Irene, his voice calm, dangerous. "Go home," Irene frowned. "What? Go home." His voice was sharp, absolute. Now, Irene hesitated, her breath uneven. Daniel, but his eyes met hers, and she saw it, the storm, the rage, the promise of war. Daniel cupped her face, his thumb brushing against her cheek. "I'll handle this," he murmured, his voice dark, lethal. "Trust me." Irene's lips parted, her body tense. But she didn't argue, because she knew exactly what Daniel was capable of. And Eleanor? Eleanor was about to find out. Eleanor was celebrating. A glass of expensive wine in her hand, she leaned back in her chair, watching the chaos unfold, the headlines, the comments, the way Irene's entire past was being picked apart, ripped open. Daniel would see the truth now. He would realize who Irene really was, and he would come back to her. But then, a sharp knock echoed through her estate. Eleanor smirked, expecting to see Daniel, furious, ready to admit she was right. She was partly correct. Daniel was there, but the look in his eyes wasn't anger. It was something much worse, cold, calculated, unforgiving. Eleanor's smirk faltered. "Daniel," he stepped forward, and for the first time in her entire life, Eleanor felt afraid. Daniel's voice was low, deadly. You made a mistake. Eleanor's breath caught. Daniel leaned in, his voice pure venom. You went after what's mine. Eleanor swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. Daniel, I was just... You think you can destroy her? His eyes darkened, his smirk cold and merciless. You think I won't burn your entire world to the ground? Eleanor staggered back, but Daniel didn't stop. His voice was lethal. You wanted war? He tilted his head. Now you have it. Eleanor's stomach twisted with fear, because for the first time she realized the truth. Daniel Harrington wasn't just a man to be played with. He was a monster in a suit, and now he was coming for her. Chapter 15, Irene had seen many sides of Daniel Harrington. The ruthless businessman, the dominant husband, the man who could ruin someone with just a few words. But tonight? Tonight, she saw something else entirely, something deadly. Daniel hadn't come home since the confrontation with Eleanor. And when he finally did, his suit disheveled, his knuckles bruised, his expression unreadable, Irene knew it was over. Eleanor was done. She stood from the couch, her heartbeat erratic. Daniel, she won't be a problem anymore. His voice was low, calm, absolute. Irene swallowed hard. What did you do? Daniel stepped toward her, his presence overwhelming. I told you, sweetheart. He brushed his fingers against her jaw, his touch possessive, dark. No one touches what's mine. Irene shivered. She should be afraid. She should be horrified. But she wasn't, because the truth was, she loved him. She loved this dangerous, merciless man who would burn the world for her. And she wasn't afraid of him. She was his. Irene cupped his face, her touch gentle against his rough, bruised knuckles. His eyes softened just for her. You're mine too, you know, she whispered. Daniel's breath caught. Then he kissed her, a slow, deep, all-consuming kiss that left no doubt. This was forever. No more games, no more running, no more Eleanor, just them, husband, wife, and the life growing inside her. Daniel pressed his forehead against hers, his voice rough. I love you, Irene. She smiled, her heart finally at peace. I love you too. And just like that, the war was over, and Daniel Harrington had won, because in the end, he always did. Chapter 16. Daniel Harrington had built an empire. He had spent his life controlling everything, business, power, people. But nothing had ever prepared him for this, for her, for the way Irene had changed him, softened him in ways he never thought possible. And now she was carrying his child, his heir, his legacy. And for the first time in his life, he was afraid. Not of losing power, not of enemies, but of not being enough. Not for her, not for their baby. He wasn't a gentle man, he wasn't made for soft things, but when he watched Irene cradle her growing belly, when he felt their child kick beneath his hand, when he saw the way she looked at him now, not with fear, but with love, he knew he would destroy anything that threatened them, even himself if it came to that. Daniel never thought he would be the man to worship the ground a woman walked on. But Irene had him wrapped around her finger, and she knew it. You don't have to hover over me, she sighed one afternoon, shifting on the couch as she rubbed her belly. Impregnant, Daniel, not dying. Daniel narrowed his eyes. You're carrying my child. That means you don't lift a damn thing, you don't stress, and you don't leave my sight. Irene laughed, shaking her head. God, you're impossible. Daniel sat beside her, his hands sliding over the curve of her belly, feeling the warmth of the life they had created. Impossible? He murmured, his lips brushing against her ear. Or irresistible? She tried to glare at him. Failed. Instead, she melted, sighing as his fingers traced slow, soothing circles against her skin. Fine, she muttered. I'll let you fuss over me, but only because I like it when you rub my feet. Daniel chuckled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Whatever she wanted, he would give her everything. Daniel, you have a board meeting. Daniel didn't look up from where he sat beside Irene, his palm resting over her swollen belly. His assistant shifted awkwardly. Sir, Daniel finally lifted his gaze, and the man immediately backed off. Cancel it. But Daniel's eyes darkened. Do I look like I care about a meeting right now? His assistant fled the room. Irene sighed. You can't neglect your empire for me. Daniel smirked. Sweetheart, you are my empire. She rolled her eyes. That was cheesy. He grinned, sliding his hand lower. But did it work? Irene sighed dramatically. Yes, fine, it worked. Daniel laughed, pressing a slow kiss to her belly. Their child kicked against his lips, and his heart stopped. His world tilted. Because in that moment, he knew. Nothing, not his company, not his power, nothing, mattered more than this, than them. Daniel had never felt helpless before, but when Irene gripped his hand, pain written across her face, he felt terror unlike anything he had ever known. She was in labor. She was screaming, sweating, digging her nails into his skin. And Daniel? Daniel would have taken her pain if he could, but he couldn't. So he did the only thing he knew. He stayed. "I hate you," Irene groaned through gritted teeth. Daniel smirked, despite the chaos. "No, you don't. Her glare could have killed a man." "You did this to me, Harrington," Daniel chuckled, pressing a kiss to her damp forehead. "And I'd do it again, sweetheart." Irene let out a shaky laugh, then screamed as another contraction hit. Daniel's chest tightened. But then, the sound that shattered his world. A cry. Their baby's cry. And just like that, everything changed. Daniel looked down at the tiny, fragile life in the doctor's arms, and when they placed the baby against Irene's chest, Daniel knew he had just lost his heart forever. Chapter 17. Irene had never known what true happiness felt like. Not until now. Not until she lay in a hospital bed, her body exhausted, her heart racing, holding the tiniest, most perfect thing she had ever seen. Her baby. Their baby. A boy. His little face was peaceful, his tiny fingers curled against her chest as he slept soundly, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just turned her world inside out. Tears burned at the back of her eyes as she stroked his soft skin, her breath unsteady. She had been so afraid of this. Afraid of Daniel, of his control, of the way he had claimed her so completely. But now she understood. This was what love felt like. This was what it meant to be his. Not just in body, not just in name, but in every way that mattered. A slow creak echoed through the hospital room. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. The air shifted, the space around her filled with warmth and power and possession. Daniel. He said nothing at first, just stepped closer, his eyes locked on her and the baby in her arms. For once he didn't smirk, he didn't tease, didn't push, didn't try to control. He just looked. Like he couldn't believe what he was seeing, like he had just lost everything and gained it all back at the same time. Irene's heart ached, because she knew he would never say it. But this was the first time Daniel Harrington had ever truly been afraid. She reached for him, taking his bruised, powerful hand and placing it over their son's tiny chest. Daniel's fingers trembled. He swallowed hard, his jaw tightening, his usually sharp gaze softened with something she had never seen before. Something raw, something real. Irene smiled softly. "You're a father now," she whispered. Daniel let out a shaky breath, his lips pressing into a thin line. Then, slowly, carefully, he leaned down and pressed a kiss to her forehead. "I know," he murmured, "and I will protect both of you. Always." Irene's heart clenched, because he meant it. With every piece of his dark, dangerous soul, he meant it. She let out a soft laugh, brushing her fingers against his cheek. "We love you too, you know." Daniel's breath hitched. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said the words that shattered her completely. "My whole world is in this room." Tears blurred Irene's vision, because she knew she had everything she ever wanted. A home, a family, a man who would burn the world down just to keep her safe. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of belonging to him. She was grateful for it. Because Daniel Harrington wasn't just her husband, he was her forever. And now, she was his too. Forever. Chapter 18. Irene never thought happiness would feel like this. She had spent so long fighting, running, denying, but now she was exactly where she was meant to be, in Daniel's arms, in their home, with their son. She watched from the kitchen as Daniel sat in the living room, their 1-year-old son in his lap, a rare softness on his usually sharp features. Daniel Harrington, ruthless, dangerous, feared by men twice his size, was currently letting their son chew on his Rolex. Irene laughed, crossing her arms as she leaned against the doorway. "You do know that watch is worth more than most people's salaries, right?" Daniel didn't even glance up. "He likes it." Their son giggled, tiny fingers gripping the metal as he babbled happily. Irene shook her head, amused. 1 year ago, she never would have imagined this. Daniel, the man who once ruled over her like a king, the man who refused to let her go, was now completely, hopelessly wrapped around their son's tiny finger. "You're ridiculous," she teased, walking over and leaning against the couch. Daniel finally looked up, his dark eyes gleaming. "I was ridiculous the moment I met you, sweetheart." Irene's heart skipped, because even after all this time, he still looked at her the same way, like he had already won, like she was his greatest victory. And maybe she was. She leaned down, brushing a kiss against his jaw. "I love you," she whispered. Daniel's grip tightened around her waist. His voice was low, rough, full of devotion. "And I will love you," he murmured, "until the day I die." Irene smiled, because she knew that day would never come, because Daniel Harrington was unstoppable. And now, he had something worth living for. A wife who was his, a son who adored him, a life that no one could take away. This was their forever, and she wouldn't change a single thing. Chapter 19. Irene never thought she could love a man like Daniel Harrington. But 3 years, 2 children, and 1 dangerously possessive husband later, she had never been more certain of anything in her life. Her world was perfect. Well, almost. Because right now she was staring at a pregnancy test. 2 bold lines. Irene's heart pounded. She was pregnant. Again. A mixture of shock, joy, and complete panic flooded her chest. She had meant to wait. Meant to talk to Daniel first, plan for it, be prepared. But life didn't work like that. And now she was carrying his 3rd child. Her hands shook as she set the test down on the bathroom counter. Daniel was going to lose his mind. Not in anger, not in fear, but in the obsessive, all-consuming way he did everything. Because if there was one thing Daniel Harrington loved more than control, more than power, it was his family. It was her. It was their children. She let out a breath, pressing a hand to her stomach. There was only one thing left to do. She had to tell him. Daniel Harrington had conquered the world, but there was only one person who could bring him to his knees, and right now, she was standing in his office, looking nervous as hell. "Irene," he said slowly, setting his pen down. "What's wrong?" She shifted on her feet, her hands clasped in front of her. Daniel narrowed his eyes. "Sweetheart," she bit her lip. "You love me, right?" Daniel blinked. Then he leaned back in his chair, amusement flickering across his face. "You're my entire world. You already know that." Irene swallowed hard. "Good, because, you might want to sit down for this." Daniel lifted a brow. "I'm already sitting." "Right. Okay. She exhaled, bracing herself. Then in one sharp breath, she said it. "Impregnant." Silence. The room stilled. Daniel didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even breathe. Irene's stomach twisted. "Daniel?" And then he stood, not in his usual controlled, calculated way, but in one swift, overpowering movement, like he had just been electrified. Then, in 2 long strides, he was in front of her, caging her in with his body. His hand slid over her stomach. His breath was unsteady. His voice was raw. "Say it again." Irene swallowed. "Impregnant." Daniel's jaw tightened. Then, his lips crashed onto hers. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't soft. It was possessive, consuming, completely and utterly overwhelming. And when he finally pulled away, his forehead pressed against hers, his hands gripping her too tightly, his voice came out as a whisper. "You're mine, Irene." Her heart pounded. "I know." His lips brushed against her ear. "And this baby?" His voice was gravel and silk, dark and full of devotion. "This baby is mine, too." Irene smiled softly, resting a hand over his. "I love you, Daniel." His grip tightened, his breath uneven. Then, in a voice so low only she could hear, he murmured, "I love you more." And just like that, her world was perfect again. The end. Written by Maria. Thank you all for taking the time to dive into this story with me. Your love and support mean everything, and I truly appreciate each and every one of you. This journey wouldn't be the same without you, and I'm so grateful to share these stories with such amazing readers. Stay tuned for more passion, more love, and more unforgettable moments. Until next time, see you in the next one. With love, always, Maria.